The most dangerous mistake a powerful man can make is believing that silence is proof of guilt. Before anyone inside the Bennett estate realized the truth, one quiet young woman was about to carry the blame for a failure she never created, while the man accusing her unknowingly stood on the edge of exposing the greatest mistake of his own life. On a crisp October evening, luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway leading to the Bennett family mansion as business partners, attorneys, longtime friends, and relatives gathered beneath sparkling chandeliers for the annual family leadership dinner. Crystal glasses reflected the warm golden lights, a grand piano quietly filled the room with soft music, and polished marble floors echoed beneath expensive shoes. Everything appeared flawless, exactly the way Richard Bennett demanded. For more than 3 decades, Richard had built a reputation as one of the most respected businessmen in the state. His words carried enormous influence, and very few people ever questioned his judgment. That was why the room immediately fell silent the moment he slowly rose from the head of the long dining table. Grace Bennett, his 25-year-old daughter-in-law, sat quietly near the center of the room wearing her familiar light blue dress. Her appearance was simple compared with the elegant designer clothing surrounding her, yet her gentle smile and calm eyes reflected a quiet confidence that never depended upon wealth or status. She greeted every employee by name, thanked the catering staff before dinner began, and helped Richard's wife to her seat without expecting anyone to notice. Kindness had become such a natural part of her life that she rarely realized she was doing anything unusual. Richard rested both hands on the polished oak table before looking directly toward Grace. "There is something this family deserves to hear tonight," he announced in a firm voice. Every conversation immediately stopped. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances, while relatives leaned forward with quiet curiosity. Richard continued without hesitation. "The recent problems surrounding our family foundation began because someone ignored clear instructions. Trust was broken, important opportunities were lost, and our reputation suffered." His eyes remained fixed on Grace. That person was Grace. A heavy silence settled across the magnificent dining hall. Grace slowly lifted her eyes toward her father-in-law, surprised but composed. She searched his face, hoping he might simply be misunderstanding something, yet his expression remained unwavering. Around the table, whispers quietly began spreading. Some relatives looked disappointed. Others looked uncomfortable but remained silent, unwilling to challenge the family's powerful patriarch. Grace could have defended herself immediately. She knew details that no one else in the room understood. She possessed information that would have completely changed the conversation. Yet, she also remembered a promise she had quietly made years earlier to protect the Bennett family whenever possible, even if doing so required personal sacrifice. Instead of arguing, she folded her hands together and answered with remarkable calm. "I am sorry you believe that, Richard." Her respectful response only strengthened his confidence. "Belief has nothing to do with it," he replied. "The facts speak for themselves." Grace lowered her eyes without another word. Watching her remain silent, many people assumed Richard's accusation must be true. No one noticed the concern that briefly crossed the face of the family's longtime attorney seated near the far end of the table. He remembered reviewing confidential records months earlier that did not match Richard's version of events, but the meeting had ended before he could investigate further. As dessert was quietly served and uneasy conversations cautiously resumed, the attorney glanced toward an old locked archive room located beyond the estate library. Something hidden inside those forgotten files had suddenly returned to his memory, and before the night was over, one forgotten document would begin unraveling a truth powerful enough to change everything the Bennett family believed. Grace quietly remained seated after Richard's accusation, allowing the uncomfortable silence to settle naturally across the magnificent dining hall. Guests slowly returned to cautious conversations, but the warmth that had filled the evening only minutes earlier had quietly disappeared. Crystal glasses still sparkled beneath the chandeliers, servers continued placing elegant desserts before each guest, and soft piano music drifted through the grand estate. Yet every whispered conversation seemed to circle back toward the young woman who had accepted public blame without defending herself. Grace thanked the server who placed a small slice of apple pie before her, smiled gently, and quietly helped Richard's wife adjust a folded napkin that had slipped from the table. Even after becoming the center of unwanted attention, she continued noticing the needs of everyone around her before thinking about herself. That quiet habit had followed her throughout every season of her life. Long before she became part of the Bennett family, Grace had learned from her own parents that true character revealed itself most clearly when no one offered praise. After marrying Richard's son, she entered a family known for influence, success, and high expectations. Many people assumed she would quickly embrace luxury and prestige, yet she never changed the simple values that shaped her life. While others measured success through titles and accomplishments, Grace measured each day by whether she had made someone else's burden a little lighter. Every Tuesday afternoon, she volunteered at the neighborhood food pantry without mentioning it to anyone. Every Thursday evening, she visited a local senior living community where she quietly read books to residents whose families rarely visited. At the Bennett estate, she often arrived before sunrise whenever Richard's wife needed help preparing for charity events or welcoming important guests. She learned the names of every housekeeper, groundskeeper, driver, and kitchen employee because she believed respect should never depend upon someone's position. Most of those small acts passed unnoticed by the family because Grace never considered kindness something worth announcing. Richard, however, viewed life differently. Years of leading successful companies had taught him to trust measurable results above quiet intentions. Every report required documentation. Every decision demanded evidence. Every mistake deserved accountability. Those principles had helped build an extraordinary business empire, but over time they also created a habit of believing that every problem must have a single person responsible for it. When difficulties recently emerged surrounding the family foundation, Richard carefully reviewed summaries prepared by senior administrators. Each report seemed to point toward one recommendation that had not been followed. Every document appeared to support the same conclusion. Grace had made the wrong decision. He never imagined those summaries were missing important pieces of the full story because he trusted the information placed before him without asking who had assembled it or what had quietly been left out. After dinner concluded, guests gradually moved toward the library for coffee while Grace remained behind helping the catering staff clear dishes from the enormous oak table. Several employees thanked her warmly because she treated them with the same kindness she showed every guest. Richard noticed the scene from across the hallway, but interpreted it only as another distraction from more important responsibilities. Meanwhile, the family's longtime attorney quietly excused himself from the gathering and walked alone toward the oldest wing of the mansion. Passing rows of framed family portraits and polished walnut bookshelves, he stopped before a heavy oak door that had remained locked for years. Behind it rested the Bennett family archive, where contracts, correspondence, board records, and legal memoranda had been carefully preserved for decades. As he removed an old brass key from his pocket, one forgotten memorandum suddenly returned to his memory, and he realized that if the document was still waiting inside those files, everything Richard believed about Grace was about to be tested by the one thing he respected more than authority itself: undeniable evidence. The heavy oak door closed quietly behind the family's longtime attorney as he stepped into the forgotten archive room hidden within the oldest wing of the Bennett estate. Dust floated through narrow beams of light shining from tall windows that had not been opened in years. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held neatly labeled binders, handwritten ledgers, legal correspondence, foundation records, and decades of carefully preserved family documents. Richard Bennett had always insisted that nothing important should ever be discarded. Ironically, the evidence capable of correcting his greatest misunderstanding had remained safely protected because of that very habit. The attorney slowly walked past rows of numbered storage cabinets until he reached a section marked with the name of the Bennett Family Foundation. Carefully removing a thick archive box, he placed it upon an old wooden table and began reviewing its contents one folder at a time. Annual reports, board meeting minutes, Financial summaries, signed memoranda, and confidential correspondence all appeared exactly as he remembered. Yet one document still seemed missing. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to recall the conversation that had taken place several years earlier. Suddenly he remembered that Richard himself had requested one memorandum be filed separately because it contained recommendations that were never presented during a board meeting. The attorney quietly searched another cabinet before discovering a sealed envelope attached behind an overlooked legal binder. His heartbeat quickened as he carefully opened it. Inside rested the memorandum he had been searching for, together with handwritten notes, internal approval forms, and email printouts documenting a series of decisions surrounding the foundation. Every page pointed toward one remarkable fact. Grace had repeatedly warned senior administrators that one financial proposal carried unnecessary risk. Rather than creating the problem Richard believed she had caused, she had documented safer alternatives and recommended delaying approval until additional information became available. Those recommendations had been acknowledged in writing, but quietly removed from the final executive summary presented to Richard months later. Someone had simplified the reports, unintentionally erasing every record of Grace's careful judgment. The attorney slowly lowered the papers, realizing Richard had never actually seen the complete file. At that very moment, Grace remained downstairs in the mansion's grand kitchen, helping employees organize leftover meals for local shelters, just as she had done after every large family event. She thanked each member of the kitchen staff, carefully labeled food containers, and made certain nothing useful would be wasted. Several employees smiled because they had witnessed her kindness for years without ever hearing her complain about recognition. Richard passed through the hallway on his way toward his private office and briefly noticed Grace carrying boxes toward the service entrance. He interpreted the scene as another example of her avoiding serious conversations instead of understanding that serving others had always been part of her character. Upstairs, the attorney gathered every document into a single leather portfolio before calling the estate's longtime chief administrator, an elderly man who had managed Bennett family records for nearly 40 years. Quietly reviewing the memorandum together, both men reached the same conclusion without speaking for several moments. Richard had publicly blamed the one person whose written recommendations had actually protected the foundation from an even greater mistake. The administrator looked toward the portfolio with growing concern before speaking softly. If Mr. Bennett sees these pages exactly as they were originally written, tomorrow's board meeting will become something none of us expected. The attorney slowly closed the leather portfolio, knowing that hidden inside were not only forgotten documents, but the first undeniable pieces of a truth powerful enough to change the Bennett family forever. The following morning, gray clouds drifted slowly above the Bennett estate as luxury vehicles once again entered the circular driveway. Unlike the previous evening's celebration, today's gathering carried a noticeably different atmosphere. Members of the Bennett Foundation Board, senior advisors, family attorneys, and several trusted relatives quietly entered the private conference room overlooking the estate. Gardens. A polished walnut table stretched across the center of the room beneath tall windows that filled the space with soft, natural light. Leather portfolios rested neatly before every chair, and a large framed portrait of the Bennett family founder watched silently from the far wall. Richard Bennett entered with his usual confidence, greeting each board member with firm handshakes before taking his place at the head of the table. He believed today's meeting would simply confirm the difficult decision he had announced the previous evening. Grace quietly entered several minutes later wearing the same modest light blue dress beneath a simple navy coat. She carried only a small notebook and politely greeted every person in the room before choosing the seat farthest from Richard. She neither demanded attention nor attempted to defend herself before the meeting began. Her calm demeanor puzzled several board members who had expected tension after the public accusation. The family's longtime attorney arrived carrying the leather portfolio recovered from the archive room. He exchanged a brief glance with the chief administrator before placing the documents carefully on the conference table. Richard immediately noticed the unusually serious expressions. "Is there something that cannot wait until after today's agenda?" he asked. The attorney answered respectfully. "There is, Richard." During a records review last night, we located several original foundation documents that were never included in the executive summaries presented to you. Richard frowned slightly. If they were not included, they probably were not relevant. The attorney gently opened the portfolio. I believed the same thing until I read every page. A quiet stillness settled across the conference room. One by one, original memoranda, handwritten recommendations, dated approval forms, email correspondence, and signed board notes were carefully arranged across the polished table. Every document had been preserved exactly as originally filed. The attorney began reading selected passages aloud. Each recommendation written by Grace urged caution before approving the financial proposal that later created difficulties for the foundation. Every warning had been documented weeks before the decision was finalized. More surprisingly, every recommendation had received written acknowledgement from senior administrators before being omitted from the condensed reports eventually delivered to Richard. No one interrupted. The only sounds came from turning pages and the quiet ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing beside the conference room fireplace. Richard slowly reached for the first memorandum. His expression remained firm at first, then gradually shifted as he compared signatures, dates, and supporting correspondence. Everything matched perfectly. Nothing appeared altered. Grace sat silently throughout the presentation, offering no explanation beyond the documents themselves. She knew the evidence could speak with greater clarity than any argument she might have offered. Several board members quietly exchanged uncertain glances as the complete timeline emerged before them for the very first time. After nearly 30 minutes of careful review, the attorney placed one final sealed folder at the center of the table. Looking directly toward Richard, he spoke with measured respect. These are the original authorization records bearing only one signature approving the proposal despite Grace's written objections. Every eye in the room slowly turned toward Richard as he reached for the final folder, unaware that the signature waiting inside belonged to the person he trusted most of all. Richard slowly opened the final folder while every person inside the conference room remained perfectly still. The polished walnut table reflected the morning light as the single authorization page rested before him. At the bottom of the document appeared one unmistakable signature. Richard Bennett. He stared at it without speaking. The date matched exactly with the week Grace had submitted her written recommendation urging the board to delay approval until additional financial reviews could be completed. Beside the signature rested a handwritten notation in Richard's own handwriting confirming that the proposal should move forward immediately despite pending concerns. The room became completely silent. Richard carefully turned the page and discovered another document attached behind it. It was Grace's original memorandum, complete with supporting research, financial projections, and several practical alternatives that would have reduced the foundation's risk. Every recommendation had been prepared thoroughly, professionally, and weeks before the final decision had ever been approved. The attorney quietly spoke. Grace fulfilled every responsibility assigned to her. She documented her concerns, submitted them through the proper process, and requested additional review. Those recommendations were acknowledged internally but never included in the executive summaries presented during later meetings. Richard continued reading without lifting his eyes. Every paragraph confirmed the same uncomfortable truth. Grace had not ignored instructions. She had attempted to prevent the very outcome he later blamed her for creating. The chief administrator gently placed another folder beside the first. Inside were email exchanges showing that Grace had politely repeated her concerns several times after the proposal advanced. Rather than criticizing leadership, she had consistently offered practical solutions while respecting every level of authority. She never attempted to embarrass anyone or challenge Richard publicly. Instead, she quietly accepted each decision once it became official, believing unity within the family remained more important than personal recognition. Several board members slowly exchanged thoughtful glances. One senior advisor finally broke the silence. I remember these recommendations now. Grace presented them during an early planning session. We agreed additional review would be helpful, but the final presentation we received several weeks later no longer included her full analysis. Another director nodded. I assumed those concerns had already been resolved. Richard carefully closed his eyes for a brief moment. For the first time since the meeting began, uncertainty replaced confidence across his face. He realized he had never personally reviewed Grace's original reports. He had trusted abbreviated summaries prepared by others because he believed they contained everything important. His lifelong confidence in efficient decision-making had quietly become the very weakness that prevented him from seeing the complete picture. Across the table, Grace remained composed. She did not interrupt the discussion or point toward the evidence supporting her. She simply listened with the same calm dignity she had shown the previous evening when she accepted public blame without argument. One board member finally looked toward her. Grace, why did you never tell Richard that these documents existed? She answered softly. Because I believed the complete records would eventually speak for themselves. I never wanted our family or the foundation divided by accusations. Her simple response settled gently across the room. There was no pride in her voice, only quiet sincerity. The attorney slowly gathered the reviewed documents before removing one final sealed envelope from the bottom of the leather portfolio. Looking toward Richard with respectful seriousness, he placed it directly before him. There is one record we have not discussed yet, he said. It explains why your original decision was based on incomplete information, and it identifies the person who removed Grace's recommendations before the reports ever reached your desk. Every eye immediately turned toward the unopened envelope as Richard rested his hand upon it, realizing the greatest mistake of his career might not have ended with one wrong decision after all. Richard slowly broke the seal on the final envelope while every person around the conference table watched without speaking. The silence inside the room felt heavier than any argument could have been. Outside the tall windows, a gentle breeze moved through the estate gardens, but inside the Bennett boardroom, even the quiet ticking of the antique clock seemed unusually loud. Richard carefully unfolded the first page. It was an internal memorandum prepared several years earlier by a senior executive who had since retired from the foundation. Attached behind it were email records, handwritten review notes, and administrative routing forms documenting every revision made before. The executive summaries reached Richard's desk. The attorney quietly explained what the documents revealed. During the preparation of the board materials, Grace's original recommendations had been condensed by several departments into a simplified executive summary intended to shorten lengthy reports for senior leadership. In the process, the supporting analysis, cautionary recommendations, and detailed financial projections prepared by Grace had been removed. No one had acted with dishonest intentions. They believed they were making the reports easier to review. Yet the missing pages completely changed the meaning of the final presentation. Richard slowly compared the original memorandum with the abbreviated summary he remembered reading years before. The difference was unmistakable. Grace had warned about every significant concern that later became reality. She had proposed practical alternatives, requested additional review, and documented each recommendation with remarkable care. None of that information had reached him in its complete form. The realization settled over him with quiet force. He had publicly blamed the one person who had worked hardest to protect both the foundation and the family's reputation. Several board members carefully reviewed the documents themselves before passing them to one another. Each comparison reached the same conclusion. Grace had fulfilled every professional responsibility expected of her and far beyond. The chief administrator finally spoke. Mr. Bennett, everyone trusted the summary because that was our standard reporting process at the time. Unfortunately, the summary no longer reflected the complete analysis. Richard remained silent. For the first time in many years, he recognized that the systems he had personally designed for efficiency had also created distance between himself and important details. His greatest mistake had not simply been approving the proposal. It had been assuming that incomplete information represented the entire truth. Across the table, Grace quietly folded her hands and listened with the same humility she had shown from the beginning. She neither celebrated the discovery nor looked toward anyone with resentment. One director finally turned toward her. Grace, you knew your recommendations had disappeared. Why did you continue working without demanding that everyone know the truth? She answered gently. Because rebuilding trust is always more valuable than winning an argument. I believed that if the records were preserved honestly, the truth would eventually be found without damaging the family. Her answer left the room silent once again. The attorney slowly gathered the original memoranda into a single organized file before placing them directly in front of Richard. These records establish the complete timeline beyond any reasonable question, he said calmly. Richard rested both hands upon the documents and slowly looked across the table toward Grace. The certainty that had filled his voice the previous evening had completely disappeared, replaced by the unmistakable weight of regret. Yet before he spoke a single word, he quietly rose from his chair, leaving every person in the room wondering what the powerful patriarch would say when he finally faced the woman he had wrongfully blamed before his entire family. Richard stood motionless at the head of the conference table, his hands resting upon the stack of original documents that had quietly dismantled every assumption he had carried for years. No one in the room dared interrupt the silence. The board members, family advisors, and attorneys simply watched as the man whose confidence had guided the Bennett family for decades struggled to find the right words. Through the tall windows, soft afternoon light stretched across the polished walnut table, illuminating the memoranda, handwritten recommendations, and financial records that had restored the truth more convincingly than any speech ever could. Richard slowly turned toward Grace. For the first time since she had become part of the Bennett family, he looked beyond her modest clothing, beyond her quiet nature, and beyond the silence he had once mistaken for weakness. He saw someone who had protected the family with patience even when she had received blame instead of gratitude. Taking a slow breath, Richard spoke in a voice far softer than anyone had ever heard from him during a board meeting. Grace, I owe you more than an apology. Every person in the room remained completely still. Richard continued. Last night I stood before my family and publicly blamed you for mistakes that were never yours. I believed incomplete reports because I never questioned whether I had been shown the entire truth. I trusted efficiency more than careful understanding, and in doing so I failed the very person who was trying hardest to protect everything this family built. Grace quietly met his eyes without anger or satisfaction. Her expression remained calm, exactly as it had throughout every accusation and every revelation. Richard slowly walked around the conference table until he stood directly before her. The powerful businessman who had spent a lifetime leading others now lowered his head with genuine humility. I spent years teaching everyone around me that accountability matters, he said quietly. Today I must live by those same principles. The greatest mistake was never the foundation decision. The greatest mistake was mine. I judged your character before I examined the complete truth. Several board members quietly lowered their eyes, deeply moved by the honesty of the moment. Richard's wife gently wiped away tears while the family's longtime attorney silently closed the leather portfolio containing the recovered records. Grace stood and answered with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every difficult moment. Richard, I accepted responsibility for protecting this family when I married into it. That responsibility never depended upon whether people understood my intentions. I never wanted anyone to be embarrassed. I only hoped that one day the complete story would be seen. Richard looked at her with visible regret. You had every reason to defend yourself. Grace offered a gentle smile. Sometimes defending the truth requires patience instead of louder words. The room fell silent once again. Those few simple words carried more weight than hours of discussion. One by one, the board members rose from their chairs, not because anyone instructed them to do so, but because they understood. They had witnessed something greater than the resolution of a business disagreement. They had watched humility overcome pride without anger, accusation, or revenge. Richard slowly extended his hand toward Grace. She accepted it warmly, not as a symbol of victory, but as the beginning of healing. Around them, the atmosphere inside the conference room quietly changed. The tension that had filled the estate since the previous evening finally began to disappear, replaced by a sense of peace earned through honesty rather than authority. As the meeting prepared to conclude, The chief administrator quietly entered the room carrying a folder marked with the agenda for the upcoming family gathering that weekend, unaware that this ordinary event would soon become the place where Richard intended to share the complete truth with every member of the Bennet family. 3 days later, the Bennet family gathered once again inside the grand ballroom of the estate for their annual family weekend reception. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from the celebration that had taken place only days before. Long tables decorated with fresh white flowers filled the room, soft afternoon sunlight streamed through towering windows, and relatives greeted one another with warm conversations, unaware that Richard Bennet had requested everyone's presence for a reason far more important than tradition. Grace arrived wearing her familiar light blue dress, greeting relatives, employees, and household staff with the same quiet kindness she had always shown. She helped an elderly aunt find a comfortable seat, thanked the catering team for preparing the luncheon, and smiled warmly at every child who ran through the ballroom. Nothing about her behavior suggested someone who had recently been proven completely innocent. She carried herself exactly as she always had because her character had never depended upon public opinion. Richard stood near the front of the ballroom watching everything in thoughtful silence. For the first time in many years, he paid attention to the countless small acts of kindness unfolding around him instead of focusing only on schedules, speeches, and business conversations. He noticed Grace quietly helping a nervous young employee arrange serving trays. He watched her comfort his wife when she appeared overwhelmed by the large gathering. He saw relatives naturally approaching Grace for advice, encouragement, and reassurance. Suddenly he understood that leadership inside a family often appeared in the smallest moments rather than the loudest ones. As everyone finished lunch, Richard slowly stepped onto the small platform normally reserved for family announcements. The room gradually became silent. Every relative expected another routine speech celebrating the foundation's accomplishments. Instead, Richard looked directly toward Grace before addressing the family. Several nights ago, he began calmly, "I stood before all of you and blamed Grace for mistakes that were never hers. I believed incomplete information and allowed my confidence to replace careful understanding. After reviewing every original record, I discovered that Grace had done exactly the opposite of what I accused her of doing. She protected this family, our foundation, and our reputation with wisdom and patience while I publicly questioned her integrity." A quiet hush settled across the ballroom. Richard continued without looking away. "The responsibility for that injustice belongs entirely to me. Authority never excuses unfair judgment. In fact, authority demands greater humility because every word carries greater weight." Several relatives quietly lowered their eyes, remembering the previous gathering. Richard stepped down from the platform and walked toward Grace. Standing before everyone present, he spoke softly enough that the silence itself seemed to carry his words. "Grace, I cannot erase what happened, but I hope I can begin repairing it. Thank you for protecting this family even when this family failed to protect you." Grace smiled gently before answering. "Families become stronger when they learn together. I have never wanted perfection. I have only hoped we would always choose truth once we found it." Richard nodded with grateful respect. He then turned toward the guests and announced that every future foundation meeting would include complete original reports alongside executive summaries so that no important voice would ever again be overlooked. The board members immediately agreed. Around the ballroom, conversations resumed with a new sense of warmth. Relatives approached Grace, not because she demanded recognition, but because they finally understood the quiet strength they had overlooked for so long. As the afternoon sunlight filled the estate with gentle golden light, the Bennet family realized that the greatest legacy Richard could leave behind would not be another successful business decision. It would be the courage to admit a mistake before everyone he loved and the wisdom to ensure that truth would always have a place at the family table. Several months passed, and life inside the Bennet estate settled into a rhythm that felt quieter, warmer, and far more genuine than before. The polished marble floors, grand hallways, and elegant meeting rooms remained exactly the same, yet something far more important had changed. The people who walked through them no longer measured one another by titles, influence, or authority alone. They had learned that the strongest foundation any family could build was trust earned through consistent kindness. Grace Bennett returned to her familiar routine without changing anything about herself. Every Tuesday afternoon, she continued volunteering at the neighborhood food pantry. Every Thursday evening, she visited the local senior living community, reading favorite novels aloud to residents who looked forward to her visits each week. At the estate, she still greeted every employee by name, thanked the housekeeping staff at the end of each gathering, and quietly helped prepare charity events without asking anyone to notice. She never behaved like someone who had finally been proven right because proving herself had never been her goal. Richard Bennett also continued his work, but everyone around him noticed subtle differences that revealed a deeper transformation. Before signing important decisions, he now requested complete reports alongside executive summaries. During foundation meetings, he invited every department, regardless of position, to share concerns before final approvals were given. He often reminded younger executives that leadership was not demonstrated by speaking first, but by listening carefully before reaching conclusions. The lesson he carried forward became more valuable than any business achievement because it had been learned through humility instead of success. One Saturday afternoon, the Bennett family gathered once again inside the estate gardens for their annual community appreciation event. Volunteers, employees, neighbors, and local organizations shared lunch beneath white tents, while children played across the green lawns. Richard quietly watched Grace helping a young volunteer organize donated books for local schools. She smiled with the same warmth she had shown on the day she first entered the Bennett family, long before anyone recognized her quiet strength. Richard slowly walked toward her carrying a small wooden frame. Without making a speech or drawing unnecessary attention, he handed it to Grace. Inside rested the original memorandum containing her recommendations together with a handwritten note he had added beneath it. It read, "The truth deserves to be remembered, and so does the person who protected it." Grace looked at the note for a moment before smiling gently. "The records belong in the Foundation archives," she said softly. "Let them remind everyone to read the whole story." Richard nodded with quiet gratitude. That afternoon, the framed memorandum was placed inside the Bennett Foundation conference room, not as recognition for one individual, but as a permanent reminder that every voice deserved to be heard before judgment was passed. Visitors often asked why such an ordinary document occupied a place of honor. Richard always answered with the same simple words: "Because incomplete information once caused me to overlook the most faithful person in this family." As the sun slowly settled beyond the estate gardens, laughter drifted across the lawn while several generations shared stories together beneath the golden evening light. Grace looked around and saw children playing beside grandparents, employees eating alongside executives, and relatives serving one another, without concern for status or position. The greatest mistake had never been the wrong business decision. It had been allowing assumptions to speak louder than truth. And from that day forward, everyone who entered the Bennett estate remembered that genuine authority is never measured by the power to judge others. It is measured by the courage to admit when you are wrong, the humility to seek the complete truth, and the wisdom to honor quiet faithfulness long before it asks to be seen.